Hey guys, before this video starts, I just wanted to say if anybody's interested in playing Blasphemous 2 but hasn't bought it yet, good news. I'm a little goblin who didn't check his email, and it turns out I got a Steam code from Team 17. After I already bought the game on Switch. So I thought I'd give it away here. There you go crazy, have fun. Don't say I never did anything for you. Hey guys, welcome to Room. Good to see you here. Yes, I am sitting in front of a mountain of cardboard. Why, is that weird? A few weeks ago, some strange news broke out. Not surprising, most news is strange nowadays, society is collapsing, and to prove that point, we have this headline. Elemental, the newest Pixar movie, has now passed Across the Spiderverse's international box office total. Now to be clear, it hasn't passed Across the Spiderverse's overall total, and it won't by the end of its run. It's only passed it in international markets, but that's still a pretty impressive feat for a movie that seemed like an absolute flop after its opening weekend. It's now the highest grossing original animated movie, as in not based on existing IP, in the last 6 years, and despite opening at just 30 million domestically, it's set to fall just short of 500 million worldwide when it's all said and done. Now, if you're a normal person who doesn't psychoanalyze box office trends, those numbers probably mean nothing to you, and if you're like me, then you read them on r/boxoffice, nod along, pretend like you understand, and then bring it up at a party later on as a fun fact, and all the girls go, "Oh my gosh, have you talked to that guy? It's so sexy the way he talks about the box office." Of course I know how the box office works, baby. I'm living in one. But for a little bit more context, let me give you a comparison to another Pixar animated movie, Lightyear, which came out last year and ended its run at 226 million worldwide with an opening domestically, meaning the US and Canada, of 50 million. Now, last year was still feeling the reverberant effects of COVID more than this year is, so there was a little bit of room for Lightyear to duck behind that cover, but pandemic or not, that doesn't negate the fact that Elemental opened a full 20 million lower than Lightyear domestically and has now more than doubled its overall run. To put it another way, Lightyear made about half of its total run in its first 3 days when you package in the international market, whereas Elemental's opening made up for only a fifth of its current total. In summary, Emily Ratajkowski, this thing has legs for days. That's the power of a strong audience score and positive word of mouth. And also the marketing genius of Claude. Oh shit, it's Claude! Whoa! He's even cooler than the guy in the back, the guy who's still talking about the box office. He's been there for like 45 minutes. But while Elemental is probably the most surprising story about animation this year, it is far from the biggest. 2023 is being driven by animated movies, commercially and critically. The second highest grossing movie of this year, just barely getting edged out by Barbie recently, is Mario. And that's from Illumination, who've been pretty consistent at delivering box office bangers for a while now, but are also slowly shedding their reputation of highly successful garbage kids movies and stepping into the realm of making highly successful mediocre kids movies. They're not like the most revered studio out there, but their last couple of movies have seemed like a decent step up from their normal output, and they're the only animation studio outside of Disney that feel like they can even sniff a billion-dollar run. If we want to talk about a serious glow-up though, we have to bring up Sony Pictures Animation, who started out alright, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs is great, and I think Hotel Transylvania has its charm, but then they went on a serious dry spell of milking that franchise, putting out bad Smurfs movies, and then the film equivalent of Satan. And then all of a sudden they just make what might be the most influential animated movie of the 21st century and Into the Spider-Verse, not to mention The Mitchells vs. the Machines, an Angry Birds sequel that was actually pretty well received compared to the first, and now Across the Spiderverse, which also lands firmly in the top 10 highest grossing movies of this year. In fact, if this list holds firm by the end of the year, which admittedly it won't because apparently Taylor Swift is a bigger box office draw than the goddamn Avengers, this would be the first time in 7 years that 3 of the top 10 highest grossing movies of the year were animated. I mean, technically you could say that 2019 had that same thing, but if Disney's gonna be stupid and call it a live-action Lion King remake when it's all digital, I'm gonna come with that same energy. I think part of what's so special about this new batch of animated movies is that there's more diversity in the studios making them now than, say, 10 years ago. For a long time, it felt so dominated by Disney, with DreamWorks occasionally going toe-to-toe quality-wise, but never financially. If you were gonna go watch an animated movie, chances are it was from one of these two, and now we have a much more open landscape at the top, no matter what metric you base it on. Of course, a lot of other studios and indie teams did put out animated movies during this time as well, and a lot of them were really well received. I'm sure a lot of people are saying, what about Klaus? What about Isle of Dogs? But those movies weren't in the public eye or dictating trends like the ones I'm talking about. They were good, but they unfortunately don't define the landscape of the medium, they just exist around it. Even Nickelodeon dropped their most popular movie since 2015 with TMNT Mutant Mayhem, which isn't up there with the big boys in the top 10 of 2023, but critically it can go bar for bar with any of them, animated or otherwise. And not only are those different studios all coming in and at the very least breaking what was becoming a monotonous release cycle where it felt like the only animated movies catching any real attention were from Disney and Pixar, and even those were losing a lot of their flair, but a lot of them are also trying to push the boundaries and norms of animation style in popular movies. TMNT features a sort of sketchbook twist on the 2D, 3D blend. It gives it a messy, almost clay-like feel that I haven't seen in many big animated movies aside from the horror subgenre, movies like Coraline, The Corpse Bride, and Frankenweenie. And director Jeff Rowe outwardly cited Into the Spider-Verse for influencing the more experimental style of this, and to a lesser extent his previous movie in The Mitchells vs. the Machines. But more than just different overall styles between movies, I've noticed a sharp uptick in different styles within the same movie, and obviously the most apparent example is the two Spider-Verse films. The new one goes absolutely insane, with every world having its own flair, color palette, materials, even fluidity, with Gwen's universe, for example, becoming more abstract the more emotional the scene got. I mean, one character in Across the Spider-Verse has more stylistic choices than Disney's entire catalog in the last decade. But even outside of this franchise, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, a fantastic movie by the way, and a really good sign for DreamWorks, who are kind of having a tough road since sunsetting their bigger franchises, will sometimes switch up to look like a fluid, moving painting in some scenes, becomes more binary in color in others to impose a sense of dread on the viewer, and does some frame rate modulation in the action scenes to make them sort of speedy and snappy. Speaking of frame rate modulation, which is essentially just switching to a higher or lower frame rate for a short period of time, while that's usually associated with the Spider-Verse movies here in the West, it actually has deeper roots in anime. This is usually done for budget reasons, but when used effectively, it has its own charm. In tandem with 3D animation, it can create a really cool moving comic book feel that some people aren't fond of from a motion sickness or choppiness standpoint, but I'd say overall, it's very positively viewed by the general public. In comparison, Disney movies since their own Renaissance period have maintained a steady, clean, rigid look. Pixar moves its around a little bit, but it's adhered to a glossy, oddly proportioned, and at least in terms of textures, photorealistic look that feels like it's on a slider from movie to movie, slider all the way up, slider a little farther down. And DreamWorks, from my memory, has only really experimented with like a couple of scenes in the Kung Fu Panda movies, which were great. The Tai Lung escape scene, post-childhood flashback, training montages, that experimentation within a single film found its way into Puss in Boots as well, and likely, at least in some way, influenced some of the experimentation in some of the other movies I've talked about in this video, and I hope it's a sustained trend because it's producing incredible results. And yeah, I know Kung Fu Panda didn't invent experimentation in movies, okay? I'm just saying, like, the shit helps. Until this point though, I've been focusing entirely on movies, but to ignore what's been happening outside of that medium would be insane, because I would argue it's blowing up even more in TV than it's diversifying in film. Frame rate modulation gaining popularity and becoming more visually enticing to people is likely tied to the steadily increasing interest in anime in Western countries. Shows like Demon Slayer, JoJo, Attack on Titan, Death Note, One Piece, Jujutsu Kaisen, they're all becoming more culturally relevant by the day. I'm proof. I've watched one of those, but I see them everywhere. Whereas until very recently, I feel like the only animes that most people had ever heard of were largely seen as kids content like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, and Pokemon. The growth of great animated content for adult audiences in general is somewhat sudden after the foundations were set in the late 90s with shows like Family Guy, The Simpsons, South Park, and Futurama. Those shows were huge hits, and then we just sort of coasted on them for 15 plus years. Until like the mid 2010s, what did we really have in terms of new, popular adult animated shows? American Dad in 05, Archer in 09, Bob's Burgers in 2011. Successful shows in their own right, but definitely more spaced out and also a rung below popularity-wise than the classics. But ever since the mid-2010s, Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman, Love, Death and Robots, Harley Quinn, Solar Opposites, Smiling Friends, the first hit season of Velma, Big Mouth is popular for some reason. There's a whole lot more adult animated shows being produced nowadays, and while that format is usually associated with raunchy comedies that don't exactly highlight their animation but use it as a form of delivering absurd ideas, we're now seeing a much wider range of subgenres in the adult animated format with this new batch. LDR is a sci-fi anthology in almost a similar vein to Black Mirror. Harley Quinn and Invincible are just superhero shows that don't hold back in terms of language and violence. A lot of video games have had their most successful adaptations in adult animation too, like Castlevania, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, and Arcane, all of which have action elements. And even The Boys has a show of animated shorts that usually follows regular people in the world of The Boys. Adult animation is no longer a classifier that's narrow enough for you to immediately know what the show's probably going to be about just from hearing the term. It's just animated content that happens to be for an older audience. It's a little bit hard to fit gaming into this discussion because it's all technically animated unless it's that godforsaken Need for Speed reboot, but obviously so much of it is photorealistic that you can sort of treat that end like it's live action. Because of how big the indie scene has gotten and how accessible certain tools have become, we've seen so many different animation styles from so many different studios that are so distinct that anything emulating it even a little is dubbed as a ripoff. You can immediately recognize Hollow Knight's style, Ori's style, Cuphead's style, Hades' style, and as the industry grows past its pretty youthful stage right now, I think we'll start seeing more buckets of animation types that we can use as classifiers. Because right now people basically treat it like pixel art, and then everything else. And if you look like anything in either of those categories, you're a scammer and you should go die. I do love that more of these indie games are pumping resources into full animated cutscenes in the marketing and sometimes in the games themselves. Clay Entertainment has always prided themselves on this. Crowsworn added animated cutscenes after hitting a certain level of funding. Hades and Dead Cells have always had great animated trailers. Dead Cells is even getting an animated show. And Have a Nice Death is probably the closest neighbor to a Saturday morning cartoon that we've seen in the games industry. I would like to see more of this in the AAA space, games like Hi-Fi Rush, but again, it's kind of hard to draw the line here because it's all animated. Overall, I do feel like the general interest in the format, no matter what the medium, is on a sharp incline, especially in older demographics. The argument that animation is for kids definitely still exists. I've had arguments with people who say that they just can't understand how to relate to animation because it's all fake, but then they'll see Mark Ruffalo's little cranium poking out of a 600-ton suit of armor and say, yeah, I buy that. But if it continues on its current trajectory, that opinion might just change. More and more animated shows and movies are finding themselves in the discussion for the best or most popular things that came out in a given year, and not just from the juggernaut tenured companies in the space. Those projects are also becoming far more experimental stylistically, and it's a little bit cyclical because the experimentation is in turn injecting a new wave of interest into the medium, which makes them more experimental, and so on. I haven't been this invested in animated projects in a long time, and I truly believe we're at the start of a huge shift in perception and quality of animation that might just lead to a very different landscape in a few years. But of course, the exact opposite might be true, because while all of this is happening, the pandemic and the writer's strike not long after have rocked the overall film and TV industry. Things are really weird in cinema right now, and its trickle-down effects have shuttered some studios and might scare execs who may not be willing to take risks based off the sort of tainted information of the last few years. For example, Mutant Mayhem is doing pretty well domestically, but it has a horrible domestic to international ratio. 3/4 of its revenue is coming from just the US and Canada, and if you look at older TMNT movies, there actually was a pretty decent international turnout. So is it because of the animation style? I don't know. I would say the answer is probably it's complicated and based on a lot of factors that we don't even understand yet for cinema in a post-pandemic world, but who's to stop a higher-up from pinning it on the unfamiliar animation style which might be seen as too American and axing a potential sequel. Spider-Verse's somewhat domestic-heavy run would also reinforce that conclusion, whether it's accurate or not. Animation studios have some of the most grueling working conditions in entertainment, and for a lot of companies, sit at the bottom of their hierarchy as one of the first things to cut if things go south. During an incredible time for animated projects, it's still not great or very secure to be an actual animator, and companies might never give them the respect that their work demands because it's just not a field with the highest profit margins. Even the Academy turns a blind eye most of the time. There have been 3 nominations for animated movies for Best Picture, all 3 were from Disney, all 3 lost. So while most of this video has been me explaining how exciting and interesting animation has been for the last 5 odd years and how I'm curious to see how it continues to evolve, in the end, we might come out of all of this with less animated movies than ever, and the ones that do come out go back to the digestible, paint-by-numbers formula that worked before. That was sort of a depressing way to end this video. Here's a funny Breaking Bad meme. Okay, bye-bye.